Morning. It's great to be with you this morning, and thanks for taking the trouble to click on that link so you can see this reflection this morning. I got a lovely photo of my eldest daughter on the steps of Downing Street in 1992. She's smiling broadly, as she often does, and she's got a T-shirt on, and it says, "Whose Earth? God's Earth." And it was a campaign I'd been responsible for at Tear Fund, and we'd encourage young people to shout out every time somebody said "Whose Earth?" with a question mark, they would shout back "God's Earth." It was all to do with the year of the Rio Summit. We were campaigning alongside British Youth for Christ and Spring Harvest. I remember well there was a giant globe about 5 foot high that was rolled around Spring Harvest a lot, and young people tried to climb on top of the world. It was a very difficult thing to do, to get on top of the world. There's a sermon illustration there somewhere. Anyway, the young people really got it. They were concerned about the environment. The campaign was a great success. While we were at Spring Harvest, I did a seminar on the subject of Christians and the environment. And afterwards, I came across a young woman who'd been in the seminar, and she was crying. Now, some of you who've heard me preach will not be surprised that my efforts sometimes reduce people to tears. I sat down next to her and said, why are you crying? What's the matter? She said she was crying because it was the first time in her whole life she'd heard any Christian talk about the environment and why it mattered. She'd been going to church all her life. Nobody had ever mentioned this at all in any of the sermons or talks she'd heard in church. To me, it was always relatively simple. One of the reasons I got involved in the campaign. The environment is another word for what we call God's creation. And it seems to me that's key to our understanding. If every time people talk about the environment, we substitute God's creation, we suddenly get a clue as to why we should care. If God made it, why wouldn't we care for it and about it? Just imagine for a moment that you're a parent and you've spent hours and hours and hours making a wonderful toy for your child to play with. And just imagine how you'd feel if you then saw the child taking it, pulling it apart, smashing it to bits, completely destroying it. And yet God made the world, God made the earth, God made the whole of creation, and human beings have set about trashing it almost right from the beginning. If God made it, we should care about it. Her tears reminded me of somebody else's tears. I seem to follow people crying around the world, really, but this time it was a pastor in a dugout canoe on the Patuca River. There were cows grazing on the bank, and it all looked a beautiful kind of rural scene. I couldn't understand why he was crying. And then I found out the reason he was crying was because the last time he'd been up the river in the dugout canoe just 2 weeks earlier, there'd been trees right down to the edge of the river. But deforestation had come. The demand for grazing cattle, which raised so much money because people wanted to buy so many burgers and so on, had meant that this area had been deforested. And he knew what that meant. He knew that the soil would get into the river. He knew it would poison the river. Slowly the fish would die. And the Indian people, of which he was the pastor, he was an Indian himself, would slowly see their livelihood go. The environment mattered to him because the most vulnerable people, his people, were the ones who would suffer as it was degraded and destroyed. Part of my job at Tearfund was answering complaint letters. Well, a great job to have. At the time of the Whose Earth campaign, God's Earth, we have to shout back, one vitriolic letter came from someone who demanded to know why Tearfund was wasting time and money planting trees when people were going to a lost eternity. I was so glad to be able to tell him a story. That I visited Ethiopia in 1984 at the height of the famine. And down in the south, where the famine was not so strong, I met Daniel, church leader. He was planting trees. And they were planting with enormous enthusiasm. I can still remember the rate at which they were going round and doing the planting. It was, they were watering, and it was going on in an enormous way. But I discovered from Daniel that the government, the communist government, had given the church a patch of desert to see if they could do anything with it. It was almost like, here's a bit of useless land. If you can do something with this, fine. If you can't, well, the church will just be seen to be useless. So I saw Daniel working away. 3 years later, he came into the office, and he was beaming all over his face. He said, "Do you remember those 6-inch saplings that I showed you that we were planting? I said, yes, I do remember. He said, they're now 30 feet tall. They've grown in 3 years at that rate. He said, and we're caring for the land. And people have seen the difference that's been made. And he said the area that we planted that in was an area where most of the people were Muslim people. And they couldn't understand why the church was bothering to do anything there. But when they saw the effort we put in, and when they saw how the trees had grown, and when they saw that the trees gave them fruit and gave them firewood and made a complete difference to their lives, well, he said, the church was planted. People wanted to know about the God who we served that made us care about people in that part of the world. So I wrote back to the guy who had complained about why we were planting trees and explained that when people do the right thing for the right reason, it has an impact for the gospel. When all we care about is preaching to people and they don't see any action that goes with it, they're completely unmoved. Those Muslim people had missionaries preaching in that area for 30 years. And I'm not under any illusion that may not have helped them to understand something about why they should be interested in God. But what actually turned the key for them, what unlocked the gospel for them, was the guy, Daniel, and the church people going and planting trees and changing their lives for the better. Well, a few years later, I was asked to write a chapter for a book which was exploring something that sounds very pompous, the Evangelical Declaration on the Care of Creation. It was an attempt to actually write down why evangelical Christians should be concerned about the environment, about the care of creation. It starts with a verse from the Bible: the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If the earth is the Lord's, then we should care about it. And this was the opening statement of that evangelical declaration. It said, as followers of Jesus Christ, committed to the full authority of Scriptures and aware of the ways we have degraded creation, we believe that biblical faith is essential to the solution of our ecological problems. Because we worship and honor the Creator, we seek to cherish and care for the creation. I was very honored to be asked to write a chapter for that book. I told some of the stories I've told you today. And then I finished up with this paragraph. Creation matters because God made it, God sustains it, and God will redeem it. If we love God with all we have, then we will share his concerns. The care of creation matters because our love for our neighbour around the world will encompass those who are vulnerable to the impact of environmental degradation. The care of creation matters because if we want people to hear the gospel, then we must allow them to see it lived and loved with an integrity and wholeness that demonstrates its relevance to their concerns as well as to their needs. So why have I told you all this? Well, this is the month of the COP26 conference in Glasgow. These words seem just as relevant or even more relevant than they did then. Christians should be at the forefront of caring about creation, about what God has made, because God made it and we're his children.